好，各位线上的朋友，大家好。非常欢迎大家今天参加我们绿盟举办的这个国际讲座。从科学观点来看核能科技与风险来谈这个核电延役与小型模组化反应炉的这个讲座那我们非常的开心，非常的荣幸可以请到这个忧思科学家联盟的艾德温莱曼博士Dr. Lyman。那这次的报名真的是盛况空前，有300多个人报名了今晚的讲座。那我相信，其实也是真的越来越多人意识到这个气候危机的急迫性那也就想知道说，到底我们应该要去选择什么样的能源、什么样的技术来取代化石燃料，然后来大幅的降低这个温室气体的排放。那的确，最近有部分的一些工商界人士，其实又再度的开始讨论所谓这个小型模组化核反应炉 SMR 这样子的一个技术，作为台湾未来低碳能源的选项。那甚至前一阵子，这个在野党也试图去修法松绑、放宽老旧核电厂的这个延役的限制。那其实无论使用这些既有的老旧核电，或者是考虑未来使用 SMR，其实这些工商界或者是政治人物等等，在发表这些推广核电的言论的时候，我们其实几乎都从来不曾看到有比较务实，然后比较负责的，同时把当中的代价跟风险也都讲清楚。那所以今天绿盟就特别的邀请到了这个来自美国的物理科学家也是这个忧思科学家联盟UCS 的这个核电安全主任艾德温莱曼博士。那请他是从一个科学的观点出发，为关心能源议题的台湾朋友们分析到底核电延役还有这个 SMR 在国际上的现况跟风险是什么。然后也去从这个比较科学的角度来看，说到底核电是不是真的是一种清洁能源，然后是一种低碳能源，以及到底如果我们真的要去大幅增加核电来作为因应气候危机的这个方式，实际上到底可不可行呢？会不会有一些挑战跟问题？那我也简单介绍一下，就是这个忧思科学家联盟，因为可能有一些台湾这个科学的社群还有关心公共政策的朋友可能有听过，但有些朋友可能不知道这个联盟。那它这个是 UCS 是位于总部位于美国的非营利组织，那是有一群来自麻省理工学院的科学家和学生在60年代创立的。那 UCS 的特色之一，其实就是强调是用一个严谨的科学方法，那透过这样子的一个方法，进行的研究来支持政策的倡议所以是希望说这个政策的推动，这些讨论是有科学为本的，用这样子的科学知识来去因应全球当下非常急迫的各种环境跟安全问题、能源问题等等。那莱曼博士是在2003年的时候就加入了这个忧思科学家联盟，然后他也在这个科学。然后自然，然后原子科学家公报等等这些权威性的学术期刊跟杂志上面发表的一些文章。所以我们今天非常非常的荣幸，请到他来跟我们分享。那在正式开始之前呢，也提醒一下大家，就是我们等一下会有 Q&A 的时间，那就请大家可以扫这个 Slido 的这个 QR code，或者是在 YouTube 的这个留言区的置顶的留言里面也有一个 Slido 的连结大家有问题的话，有想到什么问题就可以在上面提问。那请大家尽量不要直接留在 YouTube 的留言区让我们可以比较在 Slido 上面集中的来整理问题。那大家在提问的时候，也欢迎可以留下你的头衔介绍一下您是谁。那但是因为时间有限的关系，我们大概只会挑选大概3题左右的题目，没有办法一一全数回复就请大家见谅。好，那我们时间就不再这个耽搁我们就请到莱曼博士来为我们进行今天的这个演讲。好 hand it over to you, Dr. Lyman.
Okay, so I'll try sharing my screen now. Okay. Oops. Okay. Everything good?
Yeah, we can see you now. Can you use the...
Okay.
Yeah, we're all set.
Thank you so much. Okay, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today from Washington, D.C. about our concerns regarding the state of nuclear power in the world today, especially with regard to the issues of how nuclear power may be continued in the future, both with regard to extending the lifetimes of operating reactors as well as building new reactors, and in particular, the types of reactors that are referred to as small modular reactors or SMRs. So a little bit about the organization I work for, Union of Concerned Scientists. We've been around more than 50 years, and we are neither pro nor anti-nuclear, but we do believe that there are serious issues with nuclear power, including safety, security, nuclear proliferation, and cost. And these must be realistically assessed if nuclear power is to play a significant role in the future of clean energy.
好的，首先很高兴今天有机会能够跟大家在线上对谈。其实我人是在美国华府，那其实我们一直都相当关注核能以及现在世界的局势。那核能包括说现在有很多现有正在营运的就是现在服务的这些电厂，是否要让它延役？那或者说是不是要再盖新的核能电厂？甚至说现在就像刚刚主持人提到的，现在有讲到这个 SMR， 我们的这种小型的所谓的小型反应炉，这一切都是我相当关切的主题。那首先我跟大家介绍一下我的组织忧思科学家联盟。其实我们已经有大概50年的历史，成立于1969年，就是一群来自麻省理工学院的科学家。那你可以说我们不是真的说是赞成或者反对，不是那样一个明确的立场，但是我们相信就是大家都要一起去关注，比如说核能这个能源它的安全性，它比如说或者是核扩散，或者是像是它的成本啊等等各个方面，我想这是我们的组织以及我所关注的一些议题。
So nuclear power has essentially stagnated around the world in the last several decades. While some countries are building a fairly large number of new nuclear power plants, in other countries, nuclear plants are shutting down at the end of their license lifetimes. But today, there appears to be a resurgence in interest of nuclear power because it is seen as an alternative for producing energy that does not emit carbon and therefore can help to mitigate the threat of climate change.
那其实讲到核能呢，就是就像投影片上看到，就是过去大家在讨论核能本身，那一度呢核能是可能显得比较消极，就仿佛大家得到一个结论，但是阶段性的最近又因为气候变迁，大家想到核能它其实是有低碳，它排放的碳比较少，所以有一些国家它本来可能已经不会再延役，或者说它不打算再盖新的电厂，但是最近他们又从这个低碳的角度思索新的可能。
And only in the last year or two, the development and introduction of artificial intelligence, which requires a vast amount of electrical power to run the data centers that run large language models, is projected to greatly expand. And nuclear power is being seen by some people as the way to allow to meet the energy demand for artificial intelligence without increasing the carbon emissions and accelerating climate change.
那此外呢，因为人工智慧的发展方兴未艾，所以人工智慧它需要大量的电力，包括它的这个资料库或者说它的伺服器农场都需要大量的电力来支持。那大家同时考虑到，比如说核能它排放的碳是低的，所以像是这些资料库它还要跑原模型等等的时候，它需要更多的能源。那大家考虑到核能它好像因为它的碳排比较少，比较不会影响到气候变迁，于是现在大家又开始回来讨论核能。
And in the United States and many other countries, nuclear power is now being referred to as clean energy. But although nuclear power does not emit carbon when it generates electricity, it really is not clean energy because by the process of generating nuclear energy creates very highly radioactive materials that are very hazardous to the environment and to public health, and they have to be contained to a very high extent for nuclear power to be safe.
那虽然说核能它在发电的时候或者使用的时候好像不会排放碳或者碳排比较低，但实际上它整个的过程，包括说像考虑到它的废料或者实际上我们要核能生电的它完整的过程，其实它会有很多放射性的废弃物，它有很多的物质是有害于我们的环境，那会造成像是工位方面的危害，所以它核能电厂需要大量的围堵，就是我们所谓要确定它是安全的话，要有比如说围阻体，所以它不完全是洁净的，必须这么说。
And as the world saw in 2011, the Fukushima disaster, in which 3 nuclear reactors in Japan melted down and released large amounts of radioactivity, that makes it clear that nuclear power can potentially be very dangerous.
那就像也是有目共睹，在2011年就是福岛核灾的时候，那里有当时有3座核子反应炉，其实它就等于说它融化了，或者说是它就真的是有排出大量的这个辐射废水或者污染，所以究竟它的安全性是如何，我想大家心里也都有数。
And in addition to the safety risks, nuclear power also has security risks. And first of all, no matter how safe a nuclear power plant is with regard to its internal operation, it's always vulnerable to sabotage or to military attack. And as the world has seen and continues to see in Ukraine since the Russian invasion in 2022, nuclear plants such as the Zaporizhia nuclear plant in Ukraine have become the objects of military conflict, and the potential for a nuclear plant accident is very great because of the either from inadvertent shelling due to the military conflict going around the plant, or due to the potential for a deliberate attack to turn the plant into a weapon.
那此外，除了这种物理上的安全，所以物理上安全是指说像是核能电厂它本身，比如说内部的营运，它是不是要好好的运作，这样子的安全，它的安保问题也是另外一个考量。那比如说现在从2022年开打的这个俄乌战争呢，像是乌克兰它的扎波罗热这个电厂，那这时候在战争当中，它就会变成核能电厂就会变成是一个攻击的对象，它变成是在这个比如说一些冲突当中，核能电厂很容易变成军事攻击的目标。那这时候当然就会有提高，比如说有这个核电意外、核灾的可能。
And nuclear power also is unique in that the same facilities that are needed to produce fuel for peaceful nuclear power plants can also be misused to produce the material for nuclear weapons, as we have seen, for example, in North Korea.
那此外，我们如果核能它还有核扩散的风险。那即便说我们在单纯发电的时候，它可能是为了一个和平的目标，我们只是要发电。但是就像在北韩我们看到的，它如果是把这个核能它拿来做，比如说核武器的话，那当然它的风险跟它的危险层级就不言而喻了。
Nuclear power also generates highly radioactive waste that remains dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years. The only way to safely dispose of that waste over the period of time that it remains dangerous is to bury it deep under the ground in a repository. But unfortunately, only one country so far in the whole world, that is Finland, has actually developed a repository for the spent nuclear fuel from nuclear reactors. In countries like the United States, there is no progress on a long-term solution for nuclear waste.
那另外还有像核废料的问题，就是在核能生产的产生的过程当中呢，会有这些含有这个辐射性的废料，它可能要千万年，就是许久之后，它这个毒性才会消失。所以基本上最安全的方法，目前为止是要去掩埋它。但现在全球有核能的国家这么多，只有芬兰，那它真的是去开发了就是掩埋这些核废料在地层深处的一个技术。那像是美国，甚至许多其他先进国家，目前为止如何处理核废料、如何掩埋都还是停摆。
And finally, nuclear power has proven to be very expensive. In countries where the cost of electricity matters, nuclear power does not compete against fossil fuel generation, but also increasingly it is even more expensive than renewable energy like wind and solar.
那此外，核能发电它真的便宜吗？那其实，在某一些国家，在越来越多的国家，我们就去比较发现，它比一般的化石燃料生电呢还要昂贵。核能是比这些化石燃料发电更贵的。那在一些再生能源，比如说跟风力发电，还有跟太阳能电相比，其实核能也不便宜。
Now, there is again much talk about the potential to expand nuclear power despite all those problems over the next several decades. But in order to completely replace the use of fossil fuels around the world, nuclear power would probably have to triple over the current world capacity today just to replace existing generation. And it would have to probably expand beyond that if it was going to meet the demand for additional power for data centers for artificial intelligence.
那再来是，如果我们展望未来，假设我们要用核能来取代化石燃料，其实核能它的发电容量未来几十年内它需要增加3倍。那比如说满足像刚刚讲的，现在许多科技它所需要更多的这些电力，那这表示我们是要去延长现有核电厂的寿命吗？或者在退役变得不可逆之前，重新启动那些已经关闭的核电厂吗？
And so for nuclear power to expand, a number of different things have to happen. First, the reactors that are operating today around the world, roughly 400, will have to have their lifetimes extended over the original period of time that they were licensed for.
那这时候我们做一些计算的话，像我们去看现在全球大概400座就是正在服役的这些反应炉，如果要满足我们的电力需求，完全只靠这个核能的话，其实就表示他们通通这400座通通要延役，通通要继续在就是在它执照过期之后继续再延长下去。
And in some countries like the United States, there are some nuclear reactors that were shut down recently for economic reasons. But there's now a movement to try to actually bring them back to life, including the 3 Mile Island reactor, which was the sister plant to the reactor that had a meltdown in 1979.
那此外，像是在美国，我们看到就是本来一些已经退役的反应炉，那像是三里岛核电厂，那时候1979年曾经发生过这个meltdown，就是它的发生意外的这个反应炉的它的隔壁座呢，它最近就有就是比如说可能 IT 业者呢，他就说，我们应该要重启这一座核电厂，有这样子的讨论。
It's also possible in some cases to increase the power of operating reactors by as much as 25%, and that could increase the amount of power from a single nuclear power plant.
那另外也有人在讨论呢，那是不是我们要增加数十吉瓦，就是100万千瓦的新核能发电容量，这等于是要让现在在服役的这些核电厂每年增加25%以上的这个电力。
But to actually achieve an expansion of nuclear power, you would need to build essentially tens of gigawatts of new nuclear capacity every year for the next 30 years.
而且详细的计算之后，其实这种每年增加数十吉瓦，就是100万千瓦的新核能发电容量，你必须要持续30年哦，才能够满足就是我们现在的需求。如果要完全靠核能的话。
And such a rapid expansion in nuclear power raises serious questions about whether that can be done safely all around the world while not increasing the cost to a great extent. So can nuclear power actually be expanded both safely and economically? That is still an open question.
所以根据以上的计算，假设我们现在要快速的，就是尽可能的，就是在这个时间之内去扩充核能的使用以及发电量的话，我们要考虑的是它的安全性。这些活动能够安全并且合乎经济的进行吗？就是不会增加太多成本的情况之下，达成我们的目标吗？
Now, to focus on lifetime extensions, in the United States, they're called license renewals, which I guess is seen as a little bit more acceptable to the public than extending the lifetime of an old reactor. So in the United States, nuclear power plants were originally licensed for periods of 40 years. And that would mean that by the year 2030, almost all the plants in the United States would have to have been shut down.
那比如说，在美国，大家在考虑说，比如说，像核电厂，它最初可能它许可营运，它这个执照是拿40年，但是现在延役呢，大家就在算，就是其实照这个原来的执照，大多数的反应炉本来都应该在2030年之前关闭的。
So about 20 years ago, the U.S. regulator, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, developed procedures for allowing nuclear plants to apply for 20-year license renewals, so for a total of 60 years.
那为了解决这个问题，就是说面临执照过期，但是我们还需要核能发电啊。那于是美国的核能管理委员会就是主管机关，他们就讨论，就把这些反应炉运行的执照延长到再多加20年，给它多一点的延役许可。
And every plant, almost every plant has received such a license renewal, so that more than 2/3 of the U.S. nuclear fleet are now older than 40 years. The average age is around 43.
所以在这样子的延役许可之后，再加上去，其实大家应该说，在美国的这些核电厂，基本上平均来说，大家已经有43年的这个营运时间，或者说是它整个执照许可是延长到了60年，等于说已经都连续服役43年喽。
And in addition, the regulator developed procedures for going even further and allowing plants to apply for a second 20-year license renewal for a total of 80 years. And to date, 3 nuclear plants, or about 6 reactors, have actually gotten that additional 20-year period.
那不只是延役一次20年，现在有3座核电厂已经获得了后续20年的延役许可。换句话说，至少有这3座，他们现在的这个执照是可以延长到80年。那刚刚说，其实超过2/3核电厂平均都是43年，那现在一直加下去，最长已经可以到80了。
And in fact, there have even been discussions about the potential for a third 20-year extension, allowing nuclear plants to operate for 100 years.
而且这样还不够，现在还是有人在讨论，就是说，我们可以继续再延役啊，好像就是继续把这个核电厂开下去吧。所以就是甚至讨论说，把这些反应炉它的执照，最后是不是可以延长到100年呢？已经有人在讨论这样子的可能性。
So what is the logic behind giving a permit for a nuclear plant to actually operate so much longer than it was originally designed to operate to? And the basic idea that the nuclear industry puts forward is that nuclear plants are like classic cars. You just take care of them well, and they'll run forever.
所以大家想，本来这个执照是40年，然后一延再延40、60、80，甚至100，所以本来设计40年就要退役、就要除役的机器，真的可以跑到100年吗？那这个核能产业在美国他们的说法是，我们的电厂呢，就像经典的老车，这个厉害就是可以开的车子，你只要好好保养，它就可以一直跑嘛。
But of course, a nuclear plant is much more complicated than a car. And although there are many components that can be regularly inspected and fixed if they are undergoing age-related degradation, there are also components that cannot be repaired or replaced.
我们真的可以把核能电厂跟老车相比吗？那其实核能电厂是比车子远远复杂的多的。那即便我们可以做定期的检查跟修缮，那可以去维修、去保养，没错。但是就有一些在核能电厂里面的零件呢，其实它的老化还是会影响到它没有办法去更换，没有办法去修复。
And those components can be affected by aging. For example, the steel reactor vessel, which holds the fuel that drives the nuclear chain reaction that generates power, this steel reactor vessel is constantly bombarded with neutrons that are released when nuclear fission takes place. And those neutrons make the metal more brittle, or they actually turn it into a brittle material that can potentially crack.
所以像是举个例子好了，像是我们钢制的内部结构，它会有应力的腐蚀开裂。那这个应力腐蚀其实是它在这个中子，比如说我们中间在做在中子撞击，在我们在发射这个能量的时候，其实这个中子它因为有剧烈的撞击，它会去发射，或者说我们在下面的这个钢的结构，它的承载，就是中间这一整个，比如说燃料它的变化，在这个过程当中会有很多中子去撞击它。那这么多年，40年、60年、80年，它真的可以承载这个力量吗？它这个腐蚀开裂其实是不可逆的，它就是老化了，就是老化了。
And inside a nuclear plant, there are corrosion processes that are constantly going on. The environment is very harsh, both with regard to heat, with chemistry of the water, and with radiation. And these effects cause cracking of many of the metal components within nuclear plants.
那除了刚刚讲这个核分裂这个过程当中剧烈的中子撞击，还有像是整个反应炉里面它的温度、那它的热力、它的湿度等等，其实它都会带来一些物理上、化学上的就是变化，这些也都是不可逆的。
And nuclear plants also have a lot of piping that is underground. For instance, the system of fire water that's used needed to deliver water in the event of a fire. Much of that piping is underground. There are also storage tanks that are underground, and these were not intended to ever be replaced or repair.
那另外有一些地下的管线，比如说我们是要送水，比如说来送冷却水的这些地下管线，那或者有一些厨罐，那也许当初建造的时候呢，他并没有打算要去更换，他可能本来就认为40年之后他要除役，那这些管线不必更换，所以它其实也是随着时间过去，它基本上就是年久失修。
And a nuclear power plant, of course, has a lot of electrical wiring. It has cables, many kilometers of cable in all sorts of places. And that cabling was never intended to be replaced. But the insulation around the cable is affected by heat and other environmental factors, and eventually can deteriorate and potentially increase the risk of a fire.
那还有像是电缆，那比如说在这个反应炉里面或者核电厂里面，它是有很多像是要连接电啊，或者说是像这种橡胶包覆的这些缆线。那基本上这些材质，它可能从一开始设计，它可能也是只设定，比如说我服务40年，它也不是要去让你一直延、一直延、一直使用下去。那这些缆线在电厂里面就会受到热，或者说受到环境里面其他因素的影响，它会裂化，甚至增加了这个火灾的可能。
And also critically important are the containment buildings that are in place to prevent the escape of radioactivity in the event of a core meltdown. For instance, at the Manshan pressurized water reactor, you can see the large reinforced concrete containment dome. These domes also are affected by age in a number of different ways. They can lose their strength, and they can undergo chemical reactions which cause them to deform.
那另外呢，还有一个很重要的是这个钢筋混凝土建造的这个为主体它的老化。那比如说我们可以看到，就是通常这个核电厂的外形就觉得它是这个灰色的，就是好像很多穹顶这种圆顶的这种设计。那其实这些钢筋混凝土它是作为为主体，它其实也是随着时间过去，它会一点一点的这个老化脆化，就没有办法再好好保护，就是里面本来要被防堵住的这些辐射线。
So there are two fundamental questions about the safety of renewing the licenses of nuclear plants. So the first important question is, can the plant owner inspect and maintain all the components that are undergoing age-related degradation frequently and extensively enough so that they can catch problems before they become serious safety issues?
所以讲到，如果我们要去延役，让核电厂延役的话，其实根本的问题有2个。那第一个方面是，比如说这个主管者，或者说是核电，这么说好了，电厂的厂长或者拥有者主管机关，是不是可以确实的执行定期的，比如说稽核、维修，把它需要被修复的地方好好的修好。
And the second question is, for those components that cannot be repaired or replaced, can you provide enough assurance that they will maintain their integrity and their function over the extended lifetime of the plant? Can you demonstrate that they will still be working by the time the plant finally shuts down?
那另一方面呢，有一些无法被修复或者更换的部件，是不是能够在比如说它执照延长、它延役的期间，一直到最后，是不是都确认？因为它无法被更换，那是确保它整个，比如说核能，它在发电、它的运转都一定会正常到最后呢？
But there are also a lot of other questions that one really should ask when thinking about renewing the license of a nuclear plant. For instance, new information about accidents and safety risks come up all the time as more and more is known about the operation of nuclear power plants. So there are new types of accidents or more severe accidents are often better understood than when the plant was originally licensed. And the question is, are the plants still, are they really safe enough when you consider those new types of accidents that were not thought about when the plant was originally licensed?
那另外，我们在考量要不要让一个核电厂延役的时候，也要去想。那当然，我们知道，其实任何事情，像核电，它可能都会有意外，会有这样子的风险。但是它在新建之初，它有去真正考量到未来的风险吗？那随着时间过去，我们科技日新月异，我们会去分析。OK， 我们看到一些严重的意外之后，我们去分析它的成因可能是什么。那这些新的讯息可以用到这个旧的。从前盖的这些核电厂上吗？当我们知道说过往这些旧的条件可能没有办法去降低未来我们所了解的风险的时候，那这时候要怎么办呢？
And second, as operating experience is accumulated, things happen that were not anticipated, and that also raises questions about the fundamental safety of the plant.
那另外一样也是，就是假设我们把这个核电厂让它延役再延役，那这时候它也有可能会发生新的风险，也是当初就是规划之初始料未及的。那这时候我们是有准备好，知道怎么样去应对吗？
Also, plants were originally licensed based on an understanding of the seismic risk and the flooding risk and the risks of other natural disasters at the time the plant was licensed many decades ago. But more information about these risks continues to develop. Earthquake risks are better understood, flooding risks are better understood, and also things change. Climate change is driving more severe natural disasters. It's increasing the intensity of typhoons. In the US, we just saw a Hurricane Helene, which caused massive flooding in parts of the United States where it was never even anticipated to happen. And this evolution of information can sometimes raise questions about whether nuclear plants are still safe given the new information.
那另外，我们在想到自然灾害，像是地震跟洪水带来的威胁。那一座核电厂，它可能在最早规划之初呢，它那个时候的技术对于地震跟洪水或者防灾的理解，跟数十年之后，我们现在对于防灾、洪水甚至气候变迁的理解是远远不同的。那比如说，美国最近就有这个海伦飓风，那这个飓风也就袭击了许多可能从来没有被飓风侵袭过的地方，造成了很大的灾害。或者像气候变迁，它带来许多这个极端天候的这些威胁，不管是台风、飓风或者洪水，可能都变得更加的巨大。那过往从前所设计的核电厂，当时的这些安全规范，它可以因应现在我们对自然灾害的理解吗？
And finally, in the last several decades, the risk of or the potential for terrorist attacks on critical infrastructure has certainly increased, as, for instance, the United States saw in the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001.
那另外还有恐怖攻击或者军事攻击的风险。那像是2001年那时候911，美国纽约的世贸大厦，还有这个国防部五角大厦都是受到了恐怖攻击。
And as we discussed before, a nuclear power plant may find itself in the middle of a war zone, as we've seen in Ukraine with Zaporizhia. And when that plant was originally licensed and built, it was not designed to withstand a military attack.
那恐怖攻击，除此之外，还有像战争，我们刚刚讲到像是俄乌战争，那个扎波维西在乌克兰的那座电厂，相信他当初在规划设计的时候，应该是没有考量到说这座电厂可能会遇到战争，可能会变成战争当中这个军队攻击的热点。
So because of these changing circumstances, it may not make sense to renew the license of a nuclear plant because it's no longer safe where it's located.
如果从这个方向来思考，就刚刚讲的这些，其实我们要贸然的去让一个应该要退役的核电厂延役，其实是不安全的，因为有这么多新的资讯、新的讯息，而核电厂它并没有搬移，它的技术或者安全标准没有更新的时候，其实我们去延役风险是很大的。
But unfortunately, in the United States, the nuclear regulator takes a very narrow view when it considers license renewal. It does not consider all the questions that I just raised about changing circumstances. It just focuses on aging of the plant, and it assumes that everything else will just continue normally. So you don't have to consider those fundamental questions when you extend the license. You just have to focus on the plant's aging.
而不幸的，在美国，我们的核能管理委员会就是我们的主管机关呢，他在考量要不要让该退役的电厂延役的时候，他只去关注这个电厂它本身的老化问题。他觉得只要这个围墙里面，只要这座电厂本身没事，他们就认为那周围的环境也会相安无事。大家只要照着这个正常这个方式运行，他们认为世界是不会改变的。非常不幸，他们认为我刚刚提出这些问题可能都不会发生。
And so we don't agree with the approach that the U.S. regulator takes. There are other countries that do take a more comprehensive look at these questions when they consider license renewals, and they do a better job than the United States.
我刚刚讲的是美国的情况，就是在美国这个NRC 他们只考虑说电厂本身是不是有老化问题，还好在世界其他国家，其实他们是有比较多全盘的考量，会去考量比如说这些根本的环境的变化。
Now, there's a famous example in the United States of what happens when you don't manage aging appropriately. And this was at a plant which is known as Davis-Besse in the state of Ohio. And as I said before, the goal of aging management is to have an inspection regime that's intensive enough that you can catch problems early before they really risk a serious accident.
那接下来我想举一个例子跟大家分享，其实这还蛮有名的，就是在美国呢，就是俄亥俄州中西部这边，那有一个电厂，那时候当然它也是要延役，那我们本来的想法是，其实你就是要去定期而且密集的，你这个强度要够高去进行稽核。
But in 2002, it was discovered that this Davis-Besse reactor had actually developed a hole at the top of the reactor vessel that was the size of a pineapple. And in fact, there was only a very thin layer of metal, only a very thin layer of metal remained between the radioactive core and the rest of the plant.
那稽核的目标当然就是要及早发现问题，防患未然。但是在2002年呢，就是俄亥俄州这一座Davis-Besse 这个核反应炉就发现它上面有一个凤梨大小的孔，其实还不小。然后它几乎就贯穿了反应炉顶的顶盖，那中间最后只剩下一层就是薄薄的金属，有那么一层金属隔开下面的这个它的炉芯呢，就是所有的污染以及外界，就只剩下薄薄一层金属。
And if this had not been discovered in time, there was a serious risk that the reactor vessel would have ruptured, and you would have had a loss of coolant accident that could have led to a reactor meltdown.
那假设没有及早发现，其实它再发展下去，它是有可能贯穿反应炉顶盖，有可能会导致冷却剂的丧失事故，还有反应炉的熔毁。
And this problem occurred because there were failures on many levels. There was operating experience from other plants that strongly suggested that there might be a problem. There were warning signs that something was wrong that both the plant and the regulator ignored. And the regulator also allowed the plant to continue operating for economic reasons, even though there was the potential that there was a serious problem.
那这一切事故它的发生是因为，当然它系统本身有发出警告，那并且呢，就是依据可能其他电厂的经验，也觉得说这个警告不容小觑，不能够忽视，但是它就是被忽视了。 那电厂的管理阶层他没有予以重视，那或者他的监督过于松散，那甚至说就是他们就觉得说，其实也没关系了，我们就先就这样，反正好像还是可以发电嘛，就先这样照这样走下去吧，是为了经济因素，就还是继续下去。
And the root cause was economics. The reactor operator simply did not want to have to shut the plant down before they absolutely had to, because every day a nuclear reactor is offline, a utility has to buy replacement power, and it can be very costly.
那讲到经济因素，这应该就是这整个事件发生的根本原因。那因为核电厂的拥有者呢，他想要拖到最后一刻，因为你要维修或者说要把这个事故或者这个意外，等于说你不要修补好的时候，你一定要关闭整个电厂。那你关闭电厂的时候，关一天，你等于是电厂拥有者，你必须有这个责任，你要去购买这个，比如说取代的电力来提供给本来的这个用户。所以他们就是拖到最后一刻，尽可能去推迟这个昂贵的检查和修复工作。
And here's the famous picture of the hole in the head of the reactor vessel.
所以这张图就是那个凤梨大小般的洞。
So that kind of cost pressure is a concern as the fleet of reactors around the world ages, because as reactors age, corrosion continues to worsen and component failure rates are going to increase.
那成本带来的压力，就像刚刚讲的这些经济因素，那随着电厂的老化，其实也会加剧。那老化之后呢，包括它的腐蚀问题会恶化，它的元件零件的故障率会增加，就变成它所有的检查修理会越来越昂贵。
And so this means that as reactors age, inspections should become more frequent and more intensive, and there should be more money spent on repairing and replacing faulty and aging components. So as plants age, it becomes more, more challenging and more expensive to actually keep them in good working order.
那不只是说这些检查更换活动更加昂贵，其实它频率也必须要更加的密集。那因为这个就是它恶化或者劣化的可能性提高了嘛，所以不只是本身昂贵，那频率也提高的时候，那这时候核能行业它反而它觉得说成本太高了，变成大家会想要找办法要减少检查次数。大家希望说，就是面对这样子的挑战，就是是不是减少这个修缮的可能，才能降低成本？这是核能行业的想法。
But at the same time, the nuclear industry in the United States and many other countries is under increasing cost pressure because, as I said before, many plants are simply too expensive to run already, especially given the reduction in cost of renewable energy like wind and solar. And so this is putting a lot of cost pressure on utilities, which, and as a result, instead of increasing inspections and spending more money on maintenance, they want to decrease inspections and spend less money on maintenance.
那实际上，在核能行业，就像刚刚讲的，那因为像是有再生能源，我们的风力发电以及像是太阳能发电，它的成本越来越低之后，那核能它本身就已经变成越来越显贵，是越来越显贵的一个能源。那接下来，就像刚刚讲，反应炉的老化会造成这些维修工作，它必须要变得更频繁，而且每一次它的成本又提高。所以对核能行业来说呢，他们的目标变成是要去减少维修的机会，他们要去压低维修的成本，对他们来说这样子才会合算。
And the danger here is that more situations like what happened at the Davis-Besse plant will continue to occur, and that aging problems are becoming severe and increasing the risk of an accident before they're detected and fixed.
所以再想想看，刚刚那一张这个凤梨大的那个洞那张照片， 所以如果在电厂它年久失修，然后成本高昂，那拥有者又不想去修的时候，是不是就表示发生这些意外的可能会越来越高，而且会变成是在我们都不知道的情况之下，在检查变少的情况之下，这些洞却越来越多呢？
So for license renewals to be safe, it is very important that regulators make sure that these financial pressures do not lead to compromising the effectiveness of inspections.
所以回到就是我们要考量一个核电厂，我们是不是要让它延役，该退休的要不要再给它这个延长它的执照？其实有一个重点，我认为是他在做这些检查跟维修的时候，他是不是做到确实，是不是够频繁，是不是有彻底？
But it's also important to note that even when inspections are happening frequently enough, there are certain parts of the plant that simply they can't be directly inspected, or they're too hard to inspect. And so there's always going to be some guesswork involved with regard to what is going on over time.
那此外，即便这个财务压力不会影响检查的有效性，但是核电厂里面它一定也是会有一些地方它不容易或者很难被检查到。有时候你只能从它的结果或者从大概的外观来判断它是否正常。那这时候其实也会增加核电厂延役的风险。
And this uncertainty means that you can never completely eliminate the risk due to aging at nuclear power plants.
所以像刚刚讲的，有时候你是有的地方你查不到，有的地方你只能猜，这些不确定性就是随着核电厂它的老化，其实对它的安全性都会大打折扣。
Now, one of the key components in a nuclear power plant is the reactor vessel. And this is again, the steel container where the nuclear fuel is located in the plant. And water is pumped through the core containing the reactor vessel. That water is eventually turned into steam, which runs turbines. But the vessel is one of the major layers of containment for that nuclear fuel.
那再来，我想说的是反应炉压力容器它的完整性。那这个压力容器这个 vessel 这里呢，其实就是比如说水，它是送到这里来变成蒸汽去推动涡轮。那也是就是刚刚讲的这些核分裂这些反应，它发生最剧烈的地方，也是我们微珠体要去巩固的地方。
But one of the major aging effects, as I said before, is that neutrons bombard the steel reactor vessel, and in particular the welds that hold pieces of the vessel together. And those neutrons cause the vessel to become embrittled over time. And this is a serious problem because if there's a loss of coolant accident, the emergency core cooling system will inject cold water into the reactor vessel. And that cold water can cause the vessel to crack if it is embrittled.
再来，我想讲的是中子辐照脆化的问题，就是在这个压力容器里面呢，因为刚刚讲的这些这里常常有，比如说水进来变成蒸汽啦，或者说是有这个核分裂的这些剧烈的反应啊，常常有这个中子啊，它在撞击这些钢制的这个压力容器，那长久以往呢，它就是会产生辐照脆化。那这脆化会在比如说冷却剂丧失事故中，那这时候因为安全机制启动，它会注入冷水。那当中间这个压力容器脆化的时候呢，其实它很容易就破裂。
And in pressurized water reactors like Manshan, this is called pressurized thermal shock. And the reactor vessel could actually rupture very violently and create or cause an accident which really cannot be controlled at that point.
那并且刚刚讲说这个注入冷水，因为是冷却剂丧失的时候，就是紧急注入冷水的时候，因为这个温差它可能会有这个 thermal shock，就造成说温差它 更深一层的，造成比如说已经脆化的中间的压力容器它受到伤害。像之前蒙上就是另外一个电厂它发生的事故，就是因为它有这个温差，那并且在冷水注入的时候呢，造成了压力容器的破裂。
And the problem here is that it's not easy to actually predict the embrittlement phenomenon. It's very complex, especially because the reactor vessel has different materials, different exposures to neutrons. The welds, again, are particular vulnerabilities. It's just hard to accurately predict how bad the embrittlement gets over time, especially when you start going beyond 60 years. Should I repeat that or?
讲到这个中子辐照脆化其实是相当复杂的化学反应，所以你要去预测说我们的压力容器什么时候会遭遇脆化，它什么时候会开始，尤其是针对这些应该要退休、应该要退役，但是要继续服役的电厂，其实是很难去预测的。
And in the United States, originally, a number of older reactors were found by the normal analysis methods that the reactors would become too embrittled over their lifetime, and especially over the extended lifetime to 60 years. But to solve that problem, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission changed the rules and allowed them to use alternative methods to justify operating the reactor beyond 40 years.
那在美国呢，事实上就透过一般正常的分析，当然有科学家也是会去穷追，他会去看这个中子辐照脆化它的可能性。那事实上也发现了有几座反应炉，它在这个执照结束之前，或者它可能会超过可接受的这个脆化水平，就是等于说发生辐射脆化的可能性变得很高的时候 ，NRC 就是美国核能管理委员会，它的反应则是它去改变规则。它反而允许，就是我们做替代分析，就是刚刚讲的一般正常的分析方法，它就是说，那我们就换个方式来分析，来减少或者说是让本来觉得有这个风险的情况，好像看起来不是那么一回事。
And in my opinion, it's not at all clear that was a safe thing to do, because these analyses depend on certain assumptions that may not really be valid.
那就我看来，你去改变这个分析的规则，其实不是一个安全的做法，因为你如此一来，你分析的方式，或者说你怎么样去评鉴它的安全，就变成打上了问号。
Now, one more time, because of the changing circumstances that I talked about, that reactors undergo over decades, a reactor that's seeking license renewal may find itself in a very different environment than when it was originally licensed. For instance, the population density could increase. I know in the United States, many reactors were originally sited in rural areas where there weren't many people close by, but 40 years later, they are in the middle of densely populated suburbs.
那我们再回来看一下，就是环境的改变。那像是在美国，那其实这些反应炉周围的环境跟数十年前他们最初取得执照的时候可能大不相同。比如说，我们看人口密度，也许40年前这些人烟罕至的地方，我们来盖了这个电厂，盖了反应炉。可是40年后呢，本来人烟罕至的地方，可能就变成了是人口还不少的郊区。
And again, the potential severity of natural disasters like floods may be greater than originally when the plant was sited. And in the United States, for example, almost every nuclear plant did an analysis after the Fukushima accident and found that the flooding risks that they were actually exposed to were greater than the risks when they were originally licensed. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did not require them to upgrade their flooding protection.
那另外就是面对潜在自然灾害，它是不是足够因应？那比如说在美国有许多的电厂呢，他就看到像是2011年的这个福岛核灾之后呢，他们就去研究，比如说美国这些电厂，它对抗洪水或者在发生大雨洪灾的时候，它的反应能力是否足够？他们进行了详细的分析。那分析出来结果其实是远远不够的，就是比起他们40年前刚盖好的时候，面对现在当代的洪水，他们可能没有因应能力。但是即便知道了这样子的结果，就是美国当局就是 NRC， 他觉得那好像就是这样，他并没有去积极的要求这些电厂做一些规则或者安全防护上的改变。
So I think it really is important when considering whether a nuclear reactor's life should be extended, to look at whether it still makes sense for that reactor to be in the location where it was originally licensed. And it's possible that reactors are no longer located in places where there should be a nuclear reactor, and in that case, they should be shut down.
所以我觉得除了刚刚讨论到的就是各种的因素，甚至我们光看地点就好了。我们在考虑就是一个核电厂是不是要继续延役的时候，你光是看它的所在地，假设它现在周围已经变成是一个人口密集的地区，周围已经变成了一个繁华的城市的时候，那么也许执照到期的时候，那就不应该再继续了。
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about small modular reactors and my concerns about their safety and security.
那接下来我想跟大家就实际的再来谈谈 SMR， 就是我自己对于像这种所谓的小型模组化反应炉，我认为有什么值得担忧或者注意之处。
So almost every nuclear power reactor in the world today is a large light water reactor. And that means that power is on the order of 1,000 megawatts of electricity, and it uses ordinary water as its coolant.
所以目前呢，我们核能产业的主力设备都是大型的清水反应炉 LWR， 那所以它大概是有1000兆瓦的电力，它是使用普通水来作为冷却剂。
In addition, light water reactors use a fuel called low enriched uranium. And this is uranium, which is, of course, a mineral which is mined from the ground and then processed in a facility called an enrichment facility to raise the concentration of one of the isotopes, uranium-235, to make it usable in a light water reactor. And the concentration of uranium-235 in light water reactor fuel is around 5% or less. And at that enrichment, the uranium fuel cannot be used directly in a nuclear weapon. So light water reactors are relatively resistant to nuclear proliferation.
那我想多讲一下这个清水反应炉，它使用的燃料是低浓缩铀燃料。那它这个浓缩 enrichment， 它其实是就是把比如说矿场里面挖出来的铀，它透过这个浓缩的过程，让它这个浓度低于 5%， 铀235低于 5%。那浓度到这么低之后呢，它没有办法直接使用于核武器，所以就是变成它某个程度，换句话说就是可以抑制这个核武的滥用，或者说是被拿去做核武使用。
But in the last several decades, there have been, in most countries, relatively few large light water reactors have been built. Other than in China, there's really only a handful of new large light water reactors that have been built.
那这种大型清水反应炉呢，就是过去几年我们来看，刚刚不是有讲吗？就是这个核能，就是比如说电力需求恐惧，但是如果你看过去几年大家盖的新的核电厂，大家很少盖这种大型清水反应炉，除了中国，多数国家它都是盖其他种的反应炉，很少盖这种 LWR。
And one reason is that they take a long time to build and they're very expensive. So in the United States and in Western Europe, there's been pretty bad experiences with new nuclear reactor projects. They have typically taken twice as long as originally estimated to build, and they've cost more than twice as much as the original estimates, up to over 15 billion US dollars per reactor.
那为什么大家都很少盖这种大型清水反应炉呢？其实主要是像是在美国跟西欧的经验，他们就发现，就是现在要盖反应炉呢，通常成本过高，而且建造时间过长，常常就是2倍久的时间，然后要付出2倍的成本。那平均算下来呢，大概就是一个新的反应炉啊，它的成本大概是要150亿美金之谱。
And as a result, global nuclear power has essentially stagnated because plants are not being built at a rate much greater than the rate at which older plants are being shut down. So the total number has remained about the same.
那所以全球核能因此停滞不前，就是无增无减。那为什么呢？因为新的很少，然后旧的其实一些应该已经除役的，它也没有除役，所以它是确实就无增无减，几乎无增无减，停滞不前。
And so this is why the idea of a small modular reactor has been introduced. And by definition, small modular reactors are reactors that are 300 megawatts of electricity or less, or about 1/3 of the large light water reactor. And some of them are much smaller, down to less than 100 megawatts or even less than 10 megawatts. And the idea is that instead of custom building one large reactor at a site, small modular reactors could be assembled in a factory and then shipped to reactor sites and installed in a modular fashion to meet demand. So the idea is they would be mass produced and more flexible.
那为什么就是小型模组化反应炉在这个时候开始流行或者讨论度提高呢？那首先，小型模组化反应炉，它大概就是一般 LWR， 它的电量大概是发电量大概1/3左右，比如说它的功率没有超过300 MW， 那部分甚至就是低于100或者低于10 MW。那这个模组化的意思是说，它可以在工厂里面就是先组装好，然后再送到就是你反应炉要设置的地方。所以理论上，它可以透过大量生产，并且快速的组装，来有一个规模经济，能够节省许多成本跟时间。
And the advocates for small modular reactors attribute all sorts of amazing characteristics to them. They say that these are passively safe and that they can shut down automatically no matter what happens. You don't need operators to shut them down. They'll just, if any type of event occurs that's abnormal, they will just safely shut down without people needing to do anything.
那很多这个推广这种小型模组化反应炉 SMR 的人，他们说，它有很多优点啊。首先，像是它是被动安全，这被动什么意思呢？就是之前反应炉如果有什么意外的时候，我们需要人工，我们要去实际的去把这个按钮关掉。但是这种 SMR 的话，它是被动，它有问题的时候，它就自己可以远端操控，它不需要人去介入去关闭它。
And the advocates also point out that a small reactor has less radioactive material in it than a large reactor, so they claim that makes it safer.
那并且他们说，那这种 SMR 里面呢，含有更少的放射性物质，减少释放的风险，所以比较安全。
They also say that these reactors generate less nuclear waste than conventional reactors, or they can even recycle their own waste.
那除了刚刚讲含有更少的放射性物质，他们也宣称 SMR 产生比较少的核废料，甚至可以回收自己的废料。
They say that they are more resistant to nuclear proliferation than conventional reactors. That means it would be harder for a nation to misuse an SMR to make nuclear weapons.
那他们说，这种 SMR 这种小型模组化反应炉是防核武扩散的。那因为它比较小，所以对某些国家来说，即使有心，它也比较难去滥用这些 SMR 里面它的核能的素材去制造核武。
And that some SMR designs are claimed to use uranium more efficiently than light water reactors, and this would be a good thing, because uranium mining is an industrial activity that can be very harmful to the environment. So if you have reactors that use less uranium to generate the same amount of electricity, that would be a good thing.
那他们也说，就是小型模组化反应炉，它可以更有效率的来利用铀资源。那因为铀资源它是从土地里头开采，它是有限的资源。那假设同样的铀，同样的量，那你可以发出更多的电，那就是更有效率的。所以这也是就是倡议小型模组化反应炉这些人他们的一个说法。
But unfortunately, these claims are all either misleading or in some cases completely false.
但不幸的，以上这些说法，它要不就是误导，或者完全错误。
So there are many different types of SMRs. So one type is based on the light water reactor technology that is standard, again, for the nuclear power reactors around the world today, except they're smaller and they have some modified features, but they basically rely on the same technology.
那现在我们讨论 SMR， 其实它有很多种。那比如说其中一种呢，它基本上就是把这个清水反应炉呢，基本上把它缩小化，各个规格都缩小。那它也是沿用之前清水反应炉的技术。
And one example is a reactor in the United States called NuScale, which would be small pressurized water reactors, that is kind of miniature versions of Manshan, that would be 77 megawatts each.
那比如说在美国，我们 NuScale 它其实它就是一个小型模组化的清水反应炉，就是 Manshan 这个在里面可以看到小型的清水化反应炉，那就是77兆瓦电力。
Then there are reactors that are significantly different from light water reactors, and one class are liquid sodium-cooled fast neutron reactors. One example of which is the TerraPower Natrium, which was developed by a company founded by Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft. Bill Gates is a big advocate for clean energy around the world, and in addition to other projects, he's promoting the development of this fast neutron reactor. Technically speaking, it's not an SMR because it's above 300 megawatts, but a lot of people still refer to it as one.
那再来是钠冷却快速反应炉，那这也是很有名，就是微软它的创始人之一比尔盖茨他在努力推广的。因为比尔盖茨他推行这个洁净能源，所以他那时候也就是开始推这个 TerraPower Natrium 反应炉 ，Natrium 上的名字。那基本上因为它能够发的电力345兆瓦，其实技术上已经超过100，它技术上不算是 SMR。
There are also high temperature gas cooled reactors. These use helium gas as a coolant instead of water, and they also use a different type of fuel than light water reactors do. which is called TRISO fuel.
那再来是我们有高温气冷式反应炉，它是用氦气取代这个水来做冷却，那并且它用不同的燃料。这个反应炉就是这个高温气冷式反应炉，它使用的是3结构各项同性的燃料。
And in the United States, a company called X Energy is developing an 80 megawatt small modular gas-cooled reactor. And also in China, they started up a demonstration gas-cooled reactor called the HTRPM.
那目前呢，这个高温气冷反应炉在美国有一家 X Energy 公司，它已经开始生产了这个可以生产80兆瓦电力的 XE100。那在中国也有 HTRPM， 它其实也是开始 demo， 它开始有做出这个雏形。
Then there's a class of reactors that use a coolant called a molten salt instead of water. And this is think of table salt, for example, at a very high temperature, it becomes a liquid. And one example of a company that's using molten salt as a coolant is called Kairos Power. And they've been in the news this week because Google announced a deal with Kairos where the company wanted to essentially support the development of 500 megawatts of Kairos power reactors to fuel data centers for artificial intelligence.
那再来还有一种是熔岩燃料反应炉，那这种反应炉它是使用溶解在至少摄氏650度的熔岩，就是把这个盐把它烧到这个650度的时候，它就会变成液体来做燃料。那这种反应炉它可以用石墨来作为漫画剂。那最近它也上了新闻，其实就这1-2天，就是 Google 它就是去投资，它跟这个 Kairos 达成协议，因为 Kairos 它现在生产的这种 SMR 呢，大概是140兆瓦，那 Google 希望它可以就是做到500兆瓦的话，那帮助 Google 来做他们这个资料中心，就是这些伺服器农场的电力来源。
And then some people are very enthusiastic about reactors that are not only cooled by molten salt, but their fuel itself is a molten salt. That is, it's a liquid instead of a solid fuel.
那这个熔岩燃料呢，其实非常有趣，因为大家觉得对它感到兴趣比较高，是因为不只是说就是这个熔岩它自己可以就是化成就是烧到液体的时候做燃料，那并且它运作时它其实也可以用这个盐就是来做它的漫画剂，它也可以不使用漫画剂做快中子反应炉。
And finally, there's a class of even smaller SMRs, which are called microreactors, and these are less than 20 megawatts, so very tiny reactors. And one example is one called Oklo, or a company called Oklo has developed the Aurora, which is actually a fast neutron reactor.
那再来还有更小的，就是俗称的这种微型的反应炉，那它大概就是只有到20 MW， 就是以下。那在美国的话，是有一家 Oklo 的公司，它这个生产的微型反应炉就叫 Aurora， 那其实也有人在做。
And here are just some drawings. So the United States Department of Energy is actually subsidizing the development of demonstration reactors, including the Natrium, the XC100, and Kairos. So the US government is essentially paying Bill Gates billions of dollars to help him build his reactor. And one might wonder why Bill Gates needs billions of dollars from US taxpayers, but that's what the US Congress has done.
所以接下来大家看到画面上这边，就是其实美国这个能源部呢，现在他们也大力挹注许多的资金，就是数十亿美金这样的资金，就是让这些做 SMR 的公司，包括不管是钠冷却快速反应炉、高温气冷式反应炉，或者是熔岩，像刚刚讲的这个 Kairos 等等，都是 Xe100 Natrium。那其实换句话说，你就可以想象 Bill Gates 他等于是每年就拿了这个政府很多的预算，数十亿的预算来做这些就是 SMR 的开发跟设计。大家可能会想，他不是已经很有钱了吗？为什么还要拿这么多钱来做这件事呢？
So one of the most important things to understand about SMRs is that they suffer from what's called diseconomies of scale. And what this means is that everything else being equal, a small reactor is going to generate much more expensive electricity than a large reactor. And that's because the economies of scale principle says that as a reactor gets bigger, it will produce cheaper electricity. So if a reactor gets smaller, it will produce more expensive electricity.
那讲到这个SMR 的话，我觉得基本上我们要想，第一个是它没有规模经济，在其他条件相同的情况之下，相比于大的反应炉，它就是存在一个重大成本劣势。所谓规模经济，就是当你反应炉越大的时候，那你生产的单位电力成本会降低。那但是 SMR 它本身设计就是小的发电厂，那当然它生产的电力就是昂贵，它的成本是高的。
And this is a significant factor. For example, just based on economies of scale, a 77 megawatt NuScale module would generate electricity about 5 times as much as that from a 1,000 megawatt plant.
那比如说我们经过计算，那一座77兆瓦电厂的电力成本，它会比一座1000兆瓦的电厂还要高出将近5倍。
But the advocates of SMR say that there are other factors that will compensate for this economies of scale penalty. For instance, if you manufacture these modules in a centralized plant, you learn how to make them more cheaply. You have other types of efficiencies which would reduce the cost. But these kinds of factors have not been demonstrated, and it's unlikely that they would be large enough to fully compensate for this cost penalty.
那 SMR 的倡议者呢，他们认为，好啦，那即便你说，因为我们这个发电规模小，所以我们电力成本高。那如果我们把规模经济拉到生产端，也就是说，我们只要去集中的大量的生产这些 SMR，是不是就可以让它更有效率，压低它生产的成本呢？但是这种事情，或者说是这样子的说法尚未被证实，并且实际上好像也不太可行。
And so this poses significant risks because these reactors are more expensive. The developers of SMRs are seeking ways to cut costs in every way possible. So, like I said, if everything else is equal, then small reactors will cost more. But if you change things, if you make changes to the design to make them cheaper, you could possibly compensate for that cost penalty. But the problem is that those kinds of changes are going to decrease safety.
所以如果继续讲规模经济，好啦，那大家都知道 SMR 就是小型号，它成本高昂，所以 SMR 的倡议者或者这些目前在研发的生产者，他们也是想方设法要来压低它的生产成本。那压低生产成本，你要去改设计啊，但问题是它毕竟是个电厂，小的电厂，那如果你改它的设计，其实就有可能会去牺牲它的安全性。
So, for example, SMR developers are seeking changes to allow their plants to be built and operated more cheaply. For one thing, they want to build them in densely populated urban areas instead of less densely populated areas, which is currently the norm. They want to build them without the type of strong physical containment that current reactors have, that containment that's meant to prevent the release of radioactivity in the event of an accident. They want to eliminate all off-site emergency planning. That is the plans for evacuation that would be instituted that in the event of an accident. They want to reduce or eliminate security officers that protect the plant against terrorist attacks. They want to reduce or even eliminate the trained operators that keep the plant running safely. And they want to eliminate backup systems that are very important for nuclear power, because one of the principles of nuclear power is called defense in depth. And that entails having additional safety features that will be available if the normal safety features don't work. But that costs additional money, and the SMR developers are arguing they don't need those additional backup systems because the reactors are so safe.
所以为了要降低成本，想方设法，包括说就是把这个 SMR 新的反应炉设置在人口稠密的城市地区，减少这个运电的成本。那或者说他要去取消，他不要盖那个实体的微组体，他要去取消场外放射性紧急应变计划。比如说意外发生的时候，你其实是要去设定如何去疏散，你要有个计划，他们想要取消。那他要减少或者取消安保的人员，或者说这些保全人员跟设施，然后减少或取消这是实际的操作员。那对于备用电力系统，就是对于一个反应炉非常重要的备用电力，因为如果发生任何意外，你备电可以在不时之需，或者说在紧急千钧一发之际呢，可以让反应炉继续维持那么一点运作，可以避免很多灾难的发生。而 SMR 他们也认为不用啊，我们不需要这些跟安全相关的高可靠性备用电力系统。
And if regulators ultimately allow SMRs to be built without those additional safety features, that could really offset any inherent safety advantages of the design, if there are any.
所以假设他们真的能够把设计改这么多，把刚刚讲的这些取消、减少通通实现，那其实就会把它原来最初设计的时候它的安全优势给消减了，不是吗？如果当初一开始真的有那么安全的话。
And it's also important to note that just because a reactor is small doesn't mean it's going to be safer than a large reactor. The actual safety is going to depend on a lot of different factors. For instance, if you have multiple small modular reactors at a single site, safety is going to depend on how many modules there are and how they interact during accident. For instance, during the Fukushima accident in 2011, which had there were 6 reactors in a row. What happened at one reactor affected the ones next to it. So these reactors can interact, and if an accident at one module affects and causes accidents at the others, then you could have a total release of radiation as bad as if it were just one large reactor.
那再来是有一个迷思，大家想说，因为它比较小嘛，所以是不是它的影响，或者它如果万一有灾难的时候，它影响范围小吗？因此比较安全吗？其实不见得。如果说像我们看2011年福岛核灾的时候，那时候一排6个反应炉，那出事的那一个，它就影响到了它旁边的那个，所以总共是变成1+1，本来是只有一个出事，可是隔壁的那一个也没有办法幸免于难。所以即便每一个小的模组里面它放射性物质很少，那但是如果在同一个地方，那我们放了很多组的 SMR 的时候，我们如何去思考或者计算它的相互影响呢？那假设它们是会相互干扰，或者说是相互影响的话，其实发生灾难的时候，它们连锁反应带来的这些灾害，不见得小于大型的反应炉。
And of course, if you had multiple small reactors at a single site and there was a large earthquake or a flood, it could affect all of the reactors at the same time.
那此外，刚刚讲的情况，假设是同一个地点，你放了很多的这种SMR 小型反应炉，那这时候来了一个地震，来了一个洪水的时候，其实全部都会受到影响，全部都会发生灾难。
And it's also a myth that a small reactor is going to, or small reactors will produce less radioactive waste than large reactors. That's certainly true if you don't look at the actual amount of electricity that's being generated. But if you consider the amount of waste generated for each unit of electricity, small reactors are going to generate the same quantity of radioactive fission products as large reactors.
那还有一个迷思，小型反应炉每单位的发电量所生产的核废料不会比大型反应炉少哦。那当然，你说总量好啊，它比较小，所以你看它总数字好。那这个地方的这些小型反应炉，的确它生产的这个核废料总量比较少一点，比大型反应炉少。但是如果你去看每一单位发电量，每一度电，它同样也是发电，它产生的这些废料是真的不会比大型反应炉少的。
And some of the reactors that are different than light water reactors, for instance, fast reactors or molten salt reactors or gas-cooled reactors, will produce different types of waste that in some cases may be even harder to manage and dispose of than light water reactor waste.
那此外呢，就像刚刚讲，其实新科技不管是钠冷却快速反应炉、高温气冷式反应炉，或者是刚刚讲的熔岩燃料反应炉，因为是新的技术，所以它其实也是新的废料。那这些新的废料，它的处理方式相较于原来的这个清水反应炉，不见得比较简单。
And I'm running out of time here, so I just wanted to, I like to use this example just to show that a small reactor, if it has an accident or if there's a terrorist attack, it can be just as bad as a large reactor. And in fact, the United States tested small reactors back in the 1960s in the Nevada test site, where they actually blew up a number of small reactors that were being designed for a space nuclear reactor program.
那最后我也想讲一个例子，因为时间有限了。其实1960年的时候，美国政府就有在内华达州那里在测试一些小型反应炉。那时候呢，测试的结果其实是不如预期，这些小反应炉通通爆炸了。所以这些反应炉它本来这个发的电呢是要来做，比如说他们太空元件那时候这些太空设施所需要的。那但是也是因为它不如预期，测试不顺利，它就中断了。
And so one test they conducted in 1965 was called Kiwi TNT, and it involved a reactor that was about 900 megawatts of heat, which is roughly comparable to a 300 megawatt SMR.
那时候呢，这个 Kiwi 反应炉啊，是就是Rover 计划这个太空计划首批核火箭发动机的原型。那时候呢，他们标称功率大概是900兆瓦热功率，那大概就是这个300 MW， 就是我们 SMR， 你可以去换算，就是也是相当于 SMR 大概3座。
And in this test, all they did was pull out the control rods, or essentially remove the features that inhibit the nuclear reaction. So they started the nuclear reaction in a very rapid way, which any operator could do or would have the means to do in a nuclear reactor. So they essentially caused what's called a reactivity insertion accident.
那时候他们做的事情，这个测试也很简单，他们就是拉掉控制阀，就是让它去做核分裂。那这个核分裂，当时这个 Kiwi 反应炉的测试呢，其实也是就是一般的做法，那只是它核心是被封装在压力容器中，但是没有其他的屏蔽或者为主体。
And here are some photographs of what happened after that was done. So when you hear that nuclear reactors can explode like bombs, that's not entirely true.
那大家可以看到这个照片，就是它这个测试之后结果就是这样。那大家会说，核电厂很安静吗？不会有这种炸弹的声响吗？其实不是的。如果你看这个爆炸，你其实远远就可以想象它到底现场是怎么样一个震撼。
And the consequences of this, and this is a little technical, but basically it released radiation that was detected as far away as the city of Los Angeles, which is more than 200 miles away. And there was no actual radioactivity in the core when it started up. In a real nuclear reactor, you might have an accident or a terrorist attack would occur after the reactor's been operating, and there are fission products in the core. So in a real reactor, this could have been a lot worse. But basically, this did cause measurable effects as far away as, or fairly significant doses as far away as 20 kilometers. And those doses would be much higher if it had been a real nuclear reactor that had been operating. So my lesson here is that just because a reactor is small and even has passive safety features doesn't mean that there isn't a way to actually turn it into a bomb. And therefore, it always has to be protected. It should always be isolated from densely populated areas. It should have containment. It should have security. You can't give away those things and expect to have safe small modular reactors. And I will stop there. Thank you.
好的，那最后呢，其实大家刚刚看到这个照片，其实它就是一个失败的试验。那但是失败之后，不代表它这个没有后续，它其实后续是发生，包括说它有一些这个像是辐射的剂量，它其实就远远，比如说去到了200英里外的洛杉矶，那或者说其他一些数字，其实大家也可以看到，刚刚就是有闪过去的投影片也相当的多，包括距离200英尺、距离750英尺、300英尺，其实都有大量的辐射。那时候这个试验失败之后，大家一个初步的结论是，如果爆炸的时候，就是它是发生在真实的大的反应炉里面，结果会更糟糕。如果爆炸的时候，核心里面有这些裂变产物的时候，当时测到的剂量还会高出数百倍。那所以，即便它是一个小的这种反应炉，当年的就是小的 SMR， 但是如果你说不用盖微组体，你说我们可以把它放在人口稠密的地方，其实那是不可能，它依然可以还是像个炸药一样，就是这样子发生意外，它还是会这样子爆炸。我认为它的安全性还是值得我们仔细的去考量。那我就先说到这边。
Thank you for your attention today.
那再次谢谢大家的聆听。
Dr. Lyman, thank you so much for such a comprehensive and informative presentation. 那我们非常感谢莱曼博士，有给我们这么详尽的介绍跟分析，就从这个技术、经济、安全的这些面向，补足了其实台湾在讨论这个 SMR 和核电延役的议题里面，时常缺乏的这些基于科学和实证的这些数据和论述，那也带给我们更纵观的，而且更全面的这个分析的视角。其实我觉得是有助于让社会大众可以基于这个是共同的事实基础来讨论台湾未来的能源政策，然后去促成一个更健康和更成熟的讨论能源议题的方式。那接下来我们就进到这个提问讨论的阶段。那我们先有提了一个提问，一个时事题，先要来这个请问莱曼博士。那等一下我们就会再进入，接着是观众在 Slido 上的提问。那我们这边要问的这个第一个题目是，就是其实最近Google 跟这个Kairos Power 他们签了这个 SMR 的购电协议，引起了高度的关注。那我们就想要请问莱曼博士对于这个事情的看法。
The first question is about, as we saw on the news, Google and Kairos Power they signed a contract about having SMR to provide the data center power of Google. So how would you look at it?
Yes. Well, the Kairos power reactor is actually still on paper. It is considered to be a design which is of low technical maturity, which means it needs a lot more work before it can be utilized reliably. So I'm very skeptical that this deal will actually lead to real anything real over the time frame that they are claiming.
那我个人的看法呢，就是现在 Kairos Power 他们做的这种熔融岩和燃料反应炉，其实你要说它技术成熟度，我认为是还不足的。你要说能够做到这种以可靠的方式来运作，达到比如说 Google 要求的这种500兆瓦，我认为现在目前照他们的时间表看来，其实是雷声大雨点小。我觉得他们要照他们时间表实现这样子的技术，我是保持比较观望的态度，我认为不太容易。
What I think the Silicon Valley doesn't fully understand is that it's very hard to take a nuclear reactor design that's only on paper and actually turn it into a reliable reactor. And so I think they're underestimating the challenges and the complexity of doing that.
那我认为呢，现在的矽谷啊，就是比如说像是 Google 他们签了这样合约，他们的想法，矽谷的思维，他们可能觉得说，哎，我们设计图都画出来了，我们已经做过了细密的、缜密的思考。但我认为，实际上我们要把这个设计图化为实际的核电厂的建设，这之间还有很大一段路，这事实上是比原来我们设想的还要复杂。尤其要让它达到可以可靠的运转，这其实还是一条漫长的路，没有那么容易。
And there are many unanswered questions about the safety of this reactor, about what will happen to the nuclear waste from the reactor, and also about the security of the reactor, in particular, the type of fuel that Kairos and many other SMRs would use is called high-assay low-enriched uranium. And I have great concerns about this type of fuel because I believe that it could be directly used in a nuclear weapon.
那除此之外呢，就是这些新的这个 SMR，不管是钠冷却、高温气冷，或者是这个熔融岩，那它们的废料，我觉得到底怎么处理它废料的安全性，我觉得我都还要打上问号。那像是他们刚刚使用这个铀，他们这种铀，即便说它其实是要使用跟之前传统LWR 不一样的这个铀原料，那其实这些新的 SMR 这些铀原料是有可能被拿去做核子武器的。所以我认为这部分安全性他们的考量可能或者现在的科技发展也还不够周延。
好，那我们再进入到这个观众的提问哈。那第一题是想问说，就是其实核电发电的成本就是比一般发电还要高嘛？那但既然这样子，为什么还是有些人坚持要用核电呢？那如果成本比较高的话，那大概是高多少呢？
The first question from Slido. If nuclear power is so expensive, then why are countries still root for nuclear power generation? And like you said, it's more expensive, but how expensive?
Well, how expensive really depends on what you're talking about. So, for new nuclear power plants, they're always going to be the most expensive because of the capital cost. And it depends on the type of reactor. So for a new light water reactor, in many cases, the supply chain is already well established. So the materials and equipment, the suppliers exist in some cases, and there's could be even competition, which would lower the price. But if you're talking about new types of reactors that need exotic materials and exotic fuels that have never been built or operated, it's impossible to really estimate how expensive they could be. That's the first point.
对不起，我们刚刚讲到说就是昂贵，那要看说你是怎么样去评比，比如说你总不能，就是我们比如说要用苹果比橘子，那是不行的。那贵的话，像是一般的，我必须说核能它一定都是最贵的。那但是你说像是 LWR 跟我们现在的小型反应炉，那这些新的技术，比如说你要建造它，它要用新的材质，它要有新的供应商。而原来的这些核能既有的 LWR， 它的供应链可能已经比较成熟了，经过了竞争，我们知道要去哪里取得这些素材。那如果说你要开发这个新的就是核能的发电或者新的这种 SMR 的话，我相信在初期经济上来说，它自然的一定是比较昂贵的，而核能它本身电就已经比较成本高昂了。
Now the question of why countries are pursuing nuclear power when it's so expensive, I think really depends on the country and the circumstance. So, for instance, in the United States, the U.S. government is very committed to trying to reduce carbon emissions and mitigate climate change. And many policymakers have been convinced that you can't do that without nuclear power. No matter how expensive it is, you need it. And that if you actually try to calculate what the effective cost of carbon emissions is, that nuclear power would actually be competitive with renewables. But there's a lot of optimism, probably misplaced optimism, about how cheap nuclear power could be in the future that's affecting decision making.
好，那刚刚在回答就是在前一部分的问题的上半部，就是它为什么这么贵，但是很多国家还是要来使用核能。那举美国的例子来说好了，那因为在气候变迁的影响之下，那美国政府或者美国其实就觉得，那我们要去追求减少碳排，那来改善或者说是让气候变迁的影响变小。所以核能，因为大家相信，有人相信它核能是比较它的确也是。它的碳排放是比较低，所以有点像是不计成本，那我们就用核能好了，因为我们要减少碳排。那甚至有人说，哦，因为如果考量到碳的成本，其实核能是很有竞争力的。但事实并不是如此啊，就像刚刚讲，有一些像高温气冷式反应炉，它用的这个高含量低浓缩铀，不管它的废料或者说是它前期这些材料取得的成本都是比较高的，所以我认为有时候是，比如说你朝向你要低碳排，反而容易造成你对核能它的成本结构有一个误解。
And one final point is that some countries want to pursue nuclear power because they have ambitions or possibly the desire to develop nuclear weapons. For instance, Saudi Arabia has been very clear that it wants to pursue a civil nuclear power program, in fact, have its own facilities for enriching uranium, but that part of the reason is it's concerned about the Iranian nuclear weapons program, and it wants to have the potential to build its own nuclear weapons. And so that illustrates the dual use nature of nuclear power and why it can be so dangerous if it's not carefully controlled.
那另外呢，除了刚刚讲说大家因为对低碳排的乐观之外呢，在某一些国家、某一些地方，像沙地阿拉伯，那他们想要推核能或者继续的支持核能，是因为他们对于核武他们是有野心的，他们想要有这种可以做浓缩铀的设施。那做了浓缩铀之后，即便它一开始是说要拿去发电使用，但是实际上浓缩铀它也是可以做到核武使用，拿来做武器。所以这时候我觉得核能，即便它可能是为和平发电，但实际上它还是被滥用的时候，它可以造成很严重的后果。
好，那下一个题目是想要问说， 台湾政府在2025年是计划要全面废除核电。那面对越来越多的电力需求，可以怎么解决呢？是再生能源吗？那尤其台湾的半导体行业其实需要用非常多的电，这样真的够吗？
Next question is about if, for example, in Taiwan, the government's goal is to go no nuclear power by the year of 2025. However, in Taiwan, for example, the semiconductor industries, they need a lot of power, lots of utility to support all their facilities. So do you think a country that once had relied on nuclear power and it now wants to go all renewable energy or getting rid of nuclear power, for example, in Taiwan, do you think it's really feasible? Would it be enough?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't, I'm not an expert on the Taiwanese power, so I don't want to really, I don't want to say anything too specific. Again, my organization is not opposed to nuclear power, but we are opposed to deploying nuclear power if it's not safe enough. So, my message to Taiwan, and again, there are analysts and experts on both sides of the issue. There are those who say that you can't decarbonize the electricity sector without nuclear power, and there are those who have potentially radical ideas of how you can do that without nuclear power. And it is very specific to the individual country's circumstances, so I'd hesitate to make any pronouncements. I would just say that I would encourage the government and the public to really consider all the options for how Taiwan can move forward. In fact, and do look carefully at the scenarios that for the ways in which renewable energy can be deployed, on a large scale in a way which can avoid the use of nuclear power. But it's a very hard call, and the most important thing is that there needs to be wide-scale public involvement in decision making, and it shouldn't just be determined by the special interests.
那针对这个问题，我必须诚实的说，我不是台湾的专家。那我自己服务的机构，我们忧思科学家联盟，我们做的事情，其实我们只是反对在不够安全的情况之下来部署核电。那我们并不是支持或反对核电，我们只是反对在不够安全的情况之下部署核电。那台湾的情况就是如各位所提问，那我相信双方阵营或者支持或反对者都有很多的分析，很多的专家提出了见解。那当然也会有人说，如果你要除碳，彻底的就是除碳，那当然就必须要仰赖核能啊，或者有人会有一些比较有创意疯狂的想法，觉得要走向完全无碳或者是改善气候变迁等等，我相信有很多这种说法。那我认为在考虑到就是2025就是零核，那这时候接下来要怎么样向前走，我会鼓励或者我希望大家可以多想想，除了核能还有什么其他的方案，有什么选择。那如果说再生能源，那在台湾我们可以怎么样去部署或者更大规模的、更有效率的来利用再生能源呢？这都是可以思考的方向。那但我知道这是一个不容易回答的问题，也是一个很复杂的议题。但我认为很重要的是，这必须要仰赖就是公众，我们要更多的人集体的来讨论，达成一个共识，而不是只是让特殊利益或者说图利某些集团，应该要让公众透过充分的讨论来决定这件事情。
And it's also critical that Taiwan evaluate the claims. If there's interest in building new reactors or small modular reactor designs, it's critical that the safety claims be evaluated. And in particular, Taiwan, it's a densely populated country. It's a small country. It is prone to or susceptible to earthquakes and flooding. There has to be, real serious attention to what it would take to deploy nuclear power, new nuclear power safely, and how much that would cost. But don't just take the word of the vendors that their reactors are passively safe and they don't need containments, etc. That's Taiwan needs to have a robust, independent evaluation of those claims.
那再来，我也想说，就是我们在评估，比如说，不管是要盖新的核电厂、大型的核电厂，或者说我们要做这个 SMR 来，就是做核能发电的话，安全方面的评估是不可少的，而且要很谨慎。台湾是一个人口稠密的国家，我们地小人稠，那并且这里有很多的地震，有很多的台风。所以这些安全方面的考量，我们不能够只听信，比如说这些供应商他们的说法，他们可能说 SMR 是被动安全的啊，不需要人力介入啊，等等等等。那这个安全，我认为是大家要更加严谨的，以公众的力量去开诚布公，去做更彻底的讨论。那有一个健康或者活络的公民讨论来决定这件事情，而不是只去听，就是比如说供应商或者这些利害相关者他们的说法。
好，那接下来的这个题目是，想问说，您提到美国执照更新延役机制的这个缺失哦，那对于欧洲国家采取由IAEA 建议的每10年的这个定期安检 periodic safety review， 以及加拿大、法国在做的这个透过投资翻新refurbishment project 的这个延役做法，有什么样的想法？
You mentioned in the United States there were some failures or not so satisfactory reviews or auditing of the safety standards in renewing the license of nuclear plants. Well, and for IAEA, they have periodical safety review, and in Canada and in France, they have reburnishment standards. So for these different standards, do you have any preference, or what do you think about all these different standards?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not really that familiar with the IAEA's standards, but I do think, as I said, to license renewals should be holistic, and you shouldn't be restricted in the kinds of issues that should be considered. But the way the United States has set up its procedures, it just has this very narrow, limited set of issues that are considered. Anything else is out of scope. And I just think that's a foolish way to go. And so I do know that some other countries like France do have this kind of more holistic review. And, unfortunately, in the United States, the opportunity to change the way we do things is very limited. But for other countries that are considering license renewals, I think they should definitely encourage that full review. I'll stop there.
Okay. 老实说，刚刚讲的这个 IAEA 的标准我不是很熟悉，那也许就不予置评。那我个人认为，我们在做这种安全的评估的时候呢，核电厂的安全评估时，其实大家要更加的全面。那不要只是仅限于，例如说像是美国，可能他看的这个范畴就是比较狭隘，他可能只看，比如说刚刚讲过的核电厂本身的老化，他没有去考量现在已经变化的，比如说周遭环境。我所知，我大概知道法国的标准呢是比较全面性的，那只是很可惜在美国，那我觉得在美国我们的做法可能就是显得比较愚蠢一点。那我认为就是世界各地，不管你是采用什么标准，都应该是一个更全面性、更全观的一个安全评估。
One issue that I didn't mention, or I referenced but didn't explain, is if if you're renewing the license of an old nuclear reactor and there may be new, I did say there were potentially new types of accidents that people became more concerned about after the initial licensing of the reactor. And there may be modifications to the plant that could be made to reduce the risk. In the United States, again, there's no requirement that a plant actually modify or retrofit a reactor, even if there have been new vulnerabilities that have been demonstrated. But it makes sense that you would review, are there additional safety features that need to be added to really bring the reactor up to modern safety standards or not? And I think that should also be part of the license renewal review, is to look at all the ways in which you could make modifications to make the plant even safer, and have a process for deciding which ones should be implemented. But don't do it like the United States, where they require a review of those types of changes, but they don't actually require any of those changes to be made.
那我也继续讲我们自己美国的这个不好的例子好了，我讲我自己的家丑好了。那我觉得，在检查或者说是我们在稽核这些核电安全的时候，除了刚刚讲的要全面全观，我觉得还有一个重要的精神是要与时俱进。那包括说，随着时间过去，我们知道可能有新的风险，可能有新的类型的意外可能会发生。那么这些旧的核电厂，它要延役或者更新它的执照的时候，它能不能针对可能出现的新风险做出反应？有没有可能在它原来的架构上，我们做一些调整？那做一些，比如说可能是，说不上改建，但是就是调整到可以安全。那在美国，我们有做这些稽核，但是并没有强制电厂去把这些应该调整的地方落实，没有，所以我们只是检查出来，但是没有叫他们去改。那我认为这一点，我想指出来的是，假设我们要去更新核电厂的执照，不管是什么样的规则或者是标准，有了你看到了它需要做的改变，其实就应该让这个改变能够落实，让它就是这个老的核电厂，即便它延役，它还是可以与时俱进的保持安全的状态。
好，那再来一个题目是，观众问说，就是核电的议题讨论门槛一直很高，就不但这个议题本身非常的专业，那相关的这个科学背景知识，其实让一般大众很难有这个讨论和沟通的基础。那加上台湾的这个核能议题常常被政治立场所影响，所以想要询问您对于如何优化倡议和有效的公众沟通的建议是？
Speaking of discussion, this following question is about what are your recommendations or comments on how to optimize public discussion? Because in Taiwan, the discussion or the idea about nuclear safety, people think it's a high threshold of knowledge, as if the general public cannot understand the complexity of how to build a nuclear power plant, and because they cannot understand, so they are not qualified to discuss. And very often it's politicized. So the question is about what are your comments, or maybe sharing some experiences on how to optimize public discussion?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and that's something that's faced all around the world, is the kind of nuclear priesthood preserves its privileges through the jargon it uses, through its technical knowledge, and that's a concern that's always been a concern, because the experts tell the public, you just have to trust us because you can't possibly understand the complexities of these issues. So we know what we're doing. Let us, leave us alone. And that's a very dangerous, that can lead to very dangerous consequences.
好，首先我想先说， 的确，这是一个好问题。那在世界各国、世界各地都一样都有这样的问题发生。这些所谓你可以说他们是核能传教士好了，姑且这么说。那他们就很喜欢用这些复杂的用语啊、专业的说法啊，讲的大家都听不懂。然后他们自诩为专家，跟民众说：“你只要相信我就好了，因为你们不懂，这太专业了，太复杂了。你只要相信我，把这个事情留给专家吧。”而我认为这是很危险的一个做法。
But these experts, they underestimate the intelligence of the general public. And in many countries around the world, and I've met activists who are self-taught. They don't have any, they didn't have any technical training, but they learn enough about nuclear power to really participate in a very deep way in those discussions. And the problem is that that's often on a volunteer basis. That's not their normal job. They are doing it for free. And optimally, society should train or provide ways for training education of the public so that they can participate and be compensated for the work they do to represent the interests of the public in discussions of nuclear power.
那刚刚讲就是有很多这种核能传教者，他们自诩为专家，觉得说，一般的民众，他们不懂，没有这种专业的背景。但实际上，我自己在世界各地的活动当中，我认识很多倡议者，他们可能是志工，或者说是自愿投入这些行动。那但是他们是透过自学，即便他们没有所谓的专业背景，他们透过自学也是有很清楚的，可以很深度的参与这些活动倡议。那我认为其中一个可行的做法，像回答这个如何优化这个公众讨论呢，就是比如说让这些本来就是做志工无偿在做这些事的人，也许社会或者说是国家，我们有一个机制，推广更多的，比如说核能公众教育，或者做一些补贴，让更多人可以在更没有负担的情况之下，加深自己对核能的知识，也许就有机会更深化对核能的讨论。
好，那再来一个题目是想要问说，台湾目前有许多科技业者希望台湾可以引进 SMR， 那特别是这个 New Scale 的这个 SMR， 但是根据新闻的报道，美国犹他州的这个 New Scale 计划其实因为成本过高而被取消了，所以想要请问您对于这个 New Scale 的安全性和成本有什么样的想法？
The question is, we know that in Utah, a state in the United States, the NuScale project was canceled because the cost was too high. However, in Taiwan, we learned that many IT companies actually they want to have NuScale SMR introduced to Taiwan. So, how do you look at the NuScale project in Utah, and what is your comment?
Yes, well, NuScale, it's a company and a reactor which I have many concerns about. Yes, the project which is actually going to be built in the state of Idaho, but it was organized by a collective of small utilities or cooperatives in Utah and other states. They were told, these small cooperatives were originally told the same lies that we've been talking about how cheap and safe these reactors are going to be, but it quickly became clear that NuScale was going to cost much more than originally promised, and that led to a loss of interest. So it was deceptive from the beginning.
这么说好了，就是犹他州这件事情 ，NuScale 这件事情，它其实这一些 SMR 本来是爱达荷州那边所需要的，所以等于是先在犹他州这里呢，就是有几个算是合作社，或者说是就是一些厂商，他们就是集合在一起，好来做一些 SMR 之后做好就是运到爱达荷。那但是在犹他州这里，他们也是本来也是以为或者有人告诉他们。SMR 它发电是很便宜的，是很安全的， 但是这些厂商他自己做一做，一边做就发现就是根本不是，它越来越昂贵，或者说制作的过程他发现里面有很多的风险，所以他就这个计划就中断。所以我觉得重点是犹他州这件事情 ，NuScale 这件事情，它一开始就是这些制造商、这些 cooperative 他们是被骗了，所以一开始本来就是要做这件事情、要主持这个计划的人，他就就是没有心怀好意。
And NuScale is also at the vanguard of promoting the idea that that the reactor was so safe it didn't need large containments, it didn't need security, it didn't need the same number of operators as large plants. It was pushing all these regulatory exemptions that I referred to that can reduce safety. And even with those changes, that reactor is still too expensive.
那再来，我对于 NuScale 他们的安全性一直存疑。那因为他也是非常极力在倡议说，我们 SMR 我们做的 NuScale 这些机器，或者说这些反应炉呢，都很安全，所以我们不需要为主体，我们不需要保安人员，我们可以去减少或者去取消里面的操作人员，甚至他们就开始就找说，因为我们这是新科技，我们有这样的设计，所以呢，原来这个美国的核能的规范，他们觉得他们值得。可以算是找到一些漏洞，他们觉得他们可以有一些例外，而我认为核能的安全绝对不是像他们这样拿一张设计图来说就可以的。
And NuScale is also an example of why I said passive safety is not real. In the case of NuScale, they have a system, an emergency core cooling system that's supposed to be passive. So if they have a loss of coolant accident, this passive emergency core cooling system would start operating and automatically. But it was discovered that that system itself could cause problems which could lead to instability in the reactor. And so the passive system itself was simply doesn't work. And so they had to make many modifications to the design to compensate. So it just shows that this notion of passive safety is much more complex than the industry is telling the public.
那此外 NuScale 他常常说他们有一个被动安全的这个优势，但我认为或者说他们后来实际做一些实验当中也发现这个被动安全是不对的，是不正确的，它其实根本不存在。那理论上就是当反应炉它有发生意外的时候，我们会有一个 core cooling 的机制，就是灌注冷水，就是来降温。那但是像是 NuScale 它的这种被动冷却机制呢，其实它是会伤害它的反应炉，基本上它还是会造成它不可挽回的伤害。那基本上在发生意外的时候，它的所谓的这种被动安全，它其实不只是没有办法恢复安全，它其实是会损害它原来的反应炉，所以我认为这也是一个谎言。
So if companies in Taiwan really want to deploy NuScale reactors, the regulator should really critically examine the safety of that reactor.
所以回到这个问题，假如说台湾的许多高科技厂商，那希望可以引进这个小型的反应炉 SMR 的话，我认为台湾政府在安全性方面呢，必须要极度的小心，要特别的谨慎。
好，那我们进到这个最后一个题目哈，就是说想问台湾的这个核电厂的技术供应者，其实也是来自美国，核一核二是这个 General Electric Company， 那核三是 Westinghouse Electric，那因此有人认为说台湾应该以美国的这个研议制度作为标准。那所以想要请问，针对 GE 与这个 WE 的这两家公司推动核电研议，有没有什么样的不良记录
？In Taiwan, our first three nuclear plants actually are made with or collaborated with U.S. technology provider General Electric and also Westinghouse. So these two companies, General GE and Westinghouse in the United States, they are promoting the renewal of licenses for nuclear plants. The question is, have you seen or know is there any failure records or any disagreeable or not so positive examples, in the process of extending the life cycles of these nuclear plants as promoted by GE and Westinghouse?
Well, yes, and I'm not sure I have much more to offer than what I already talked about. The fact is that there are safety issues that have developed over time. One issue are the steam generators. So for the Westinghouse pressurized water reactors, they have steam generators, which are used to transfer the heat from the primary coolant system to the secondary system that powers the turbines. And these consist of thousands of tubes. And Westinghouse ran into a lot of trouble very early on because the steam generators that were supplied with the original reactors were made of a type of metal that experienced significant problems, degradation, corrosion, leakage. And so those steam generators had to be replaced in almost every Westinghouse reactor around the world. Now, the new steam generators were made from different metal that was less susceptible, but still is experiencing problems. So, and this is clear. So the Palisades nuclear reactor in the United States, which was shut down 2 years ago and was originally supposed to be decommissioned, is now being considered for restart. And the U.S. government is providing, essentially hundreds of millions of dollars or even billions of U.S. dollars to restart this plant. And it was discovered that the steam generators have experienced significant degradation that was not expected. In fact, there are new phenomena that are being discovered all the time, new types of corrosion damage in new places that are raising questions about steam generator safety and whether they have to be replaced again. And so that's one issue that's coming up. And with regard to boiling water reactors, there's I'm less familiar with any recent examples, but the larger issue is that there is corrosion. There are corrosion processes that are not well understood, and that as I pointed out, was one of the big issues with license renewal, is because if there are corrosion processes that aren't well understood, you may not be inspecting areas that you really need to inspect because you don't think there's going to be a problem, and that's the danger there. So there has to be, there are programs, both the Westinghouse and the General Electric utility owners groups have programs for studying, material degradation, corrosion, but you can always do more. And their tendency is, again, to downplay corrosion or the seriousness of corrosion so that the number of inspections and the intensity of inspections can be reduced. And that's a dangerous trend that needs to be opposed.
好，我想说的是，其实我刚刚在我的演讲当中也讲了蛮多的，我努力想一下，我希望以下的说明可以就是回答这个问题。那我所知道，像 Westinghouse， 那他们之前一度因为就是在蒸汽管线这个地方，就是世界各地的 Westinghouse 盖的这个反应炉呢，他们的蒸汽管线都后来都有出现 就是不管是腐蚀或者劣化的情况，那一度呢，就是 Westinghouse 它必须到世界各地他们自己制造的反应炉去更换这个部分的零件。那目前所知是因为它这个蒸汽管线是说要在它的冷却系统里面，它从主要的 primary 的 cooler 里面要把蒸汽送到secondary 就是次要的系统里面，那中间这些管线它是很容易锈蚀腐蚀的，或者是不同的化学方式去就是变坏掉。那它可能坏掉之后没有修的话，它可能会有漏，或者说是造成其他的问题。所以其实 Westinghouse 它一度就是真的要去世界各地把所有反应炉，就是它这个蒸汽管线去把它修补起来。那后来他们换了一种金属，换了一个材质，但其实没有解决问题哦，只是就是那个材质金属可能比较耐用一点，比原来已经用了很久的好一点，但是其实问题没有完全解决。那如果说是沸水式的反应炉，我不是很确定，但是沸水式反应炉一样，它其实也是因为这些蒸汽，它会造成一些管线的腐蚀。那我觉得重点是，这些服务提供者，比如说是 GE 或者是 Westinghouse 他们的态度。那因为在美国，他们在做这些稽核或者发现这些问题的时候，他们的倾向是去就是要大事化小。他们觉得说，就是不要把这个事情想得那么复杂，因为他们的目标是要让这些电厂延役，要去降低他们稽核的频率，减少他们稽核的成本，减少这些维修的成本。所以明明就有这些问题存在的时候呢，这些厂商他其实是就是大事化小，他不愿意去确实的改善，确实的去面对。我觉得这件事情可能是比较不好的，比较糟糕的。我觉得这其实是比较大的问题，因为如果这些厂商他们有心，比如说把这些管线它腐蚀的方式去把它研究出来，那么在下一次稽核的时候，就会比较清楚你要去看哪里，去确实的检查哪里，而不是可能该看的地方没看，那只是草草了事。
Thank you, Dr. Lyman. We truly appreciate the depth of knowledge and clarity you brought to this complex topic. 那我们就这个 Q&A 就先到这边告一个段落。非常感谢莱曼博士，就是给大家的这些各种提问，其实都有非常详尽的这样子的回应跟解释。那刚才其实莱曼博士在讲的时候，我其实非常的有共鸣，就是说，我们怎么看待这个议题？其实要从更多不同的面向去掌握不同的资讯。那对于这些风险，所以对于这些代价有更多的掌握，然后才可以去评估这么样一个复杂的议题。那对于其实在这个核电产业啊这些既得的这个产业的利益者里面的提出的这些各种的宣传跟这些行销的说法，其实大家才有办法自己去判断说，在这些宣称，在这些乐观的判断，在这些乐观的承诺背后，到底实际上的这些限制跟代价跟风险到底是什么？那台湾又是否有条件去承受这些代价跟风险？那谁要来承担这些代价跟风险？那在我们这个讲座结束之前呢，请大家给我一些时间哈，我们想要请大家给我们这样一些回馈哈，我们就是办这样子的讲座，就是在这个进行的过程，或大家对于这个内容有没有什么样的一些回馈，或给我们一些改进的建议，可以提供给我们。那好，可以提供给我们。那就是也欢迎大家可以小额捐款，就是支持我们。就是说，其实刚才莱曼博士也讲嘛，就是说要怎么样促进这样子的讨论，大家可以其实是很需要公众教育，需要让更多人可以去理解这样复杂的议题，然后可以有一个比较好的、比较健康的政策的讨论。所以其实也很需要大家的捐款支持绿盟，因为其实绿盟是一个不拿这个政府的补助，也不接受企业财团的捐款，所以其实是很需要仰赖一般大众。今天在线上的各位可以捐款支持像绿盟这样的一个组织，那可以去做这样子的议题的研究、倡议，还有教育跟推广。所以请大家今天在结束之前可以帮我们扫这个 QR code。那最后也想要再请问莱曼博士，有没有最后想要跟台湾的这些听众分享的话呢
？Last but not least, is there anything you would like to say and share with the audiences in Taiwan?
Is that for me?
Yes, anything you would like to share and talk to the audiences in Taiwan?
Yes, well, again, I appreciate your attendance today, and I These are very complex issues, and I wish you the best, and I hope that society will make good decisions to protect the public from, as well as be able to move forward with decarbonizing the environment. And I just urge you to continue to learn, study, and engage in these issues to make sure that the special interests and big business don't make decisions that are not in the public interest. So thank you.
好的，那首先谢谢各位，就是这个晚上这段时间的聆听。那当然也是祝福台湾就是一切顺利。那也希望台湾的社会呢，可以就是透过公众的讨论，那做出一个好的决策，保护大众，可以就是避免这些风险或者是伤害，有一个安全的决定。那可以在这个除碳趋势之下呢，就是稳稳的迈步向前。那也希望就是在做这个决策的时候呢，做出来的这些利益是倾向大众的，不是由在商言商的人去照顾到特别的利益，而是把利益给到大众。所以祝福大家。
Thank you, Dr. Lyman. Your presentation has really given us much to reflect on. 那我们最后就是再次谢谢莱曼博士给我们带来今天这么精彩的这些资讯跟这么全面的分析。那也很谢谢各位今天在线上的所有朋友，就是花这么多时间跟我们一起聆听这一场讲座，然后有这么精彩的这些提问跟 Q&A。那再次感谢大家。那我们今天的讲座就到这边结束了。
So by this note, we conclude today's session. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Lyman.